From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, October 13. Tomorrow, Australia will decide the fate of the voice to Parliament when we turn out to vote in the historic referendum on Indigenous recognition. The poll is the culmination of a years-long process which began with the Uluru Dialogues and has ended in a debate which no campaigners say has divided Australia. All the polling shows that the voice referendum will fail to pass, which will represent a hugely significant moment in the history of reconciliation. Such a moment will surely devastate the Aboriginal leaders who have spent years campaigning for this reform. So what happens after the referendum? Where to next for the project of reconciliation? And what does this all tell us about our national character? Joining us today to discuss, we have Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe and Age and Sydney Morning Herald columnist Sean Kelly. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hi, Jackie.
Thanks for having us.
So the horrendous events in Israel obviously dominated the news this week and soaked up a lot of oxygen. But this was also the last week, of course, that the Yes campaign, which is lagging in the polls, had to push its message. David, how has the Israel-Hamas war affected that last week of campaigning for the Yes campaign?
I think it means that this final week of what's meant to be the Yes campaign is really a week focused entirely elsewhere. And it's focused elsewhere for good reason. I mean, what's happening in the Middle East is shocking. The murder of people in Israel has been, appalling. And it's something that has, for good reason, drawn attention from all sides of politics and from a lot of Australians. And we're seeing that with the readership of the coverage that we're providing. So for good reason, the debate is now about security, international security, and also the implications here with the protests that were out the front of the Sydney Opera House, raising very real questions about how the protest went ahead and how it ended up with people chanting anti-Semitic calls. So that is something that rightly takes the attention of Australian politics.
Sean, do you think the Israel-Hamas war has affected the national psyche in a negative way, or what's the sort of atmosphere change that might feed into the referendum vote on Saturday?
Look, these matters are so tricky. It always feels a little bit awful to be talking about the impact of such a horrific thing on, a domestic political race of sorts elsewhere, albeit a very significant political race. That said, I don't think it's an atmospherics question so much. I think it is just a question of we live in an attention economy. The Yes campaign obviously is going into this final week behind. They needed to persuade as many people as possible. They needed to change minds. And I think in that type of environment, if you are the side that is behind, you want attention on the race. You need attention on the race, and they simply haven't had that. And I don't think it is just a function of that. I think there is an odd thing in this referendum that a lot of, and maybe this is the case for every referendum, that in a sense there isn't much new to say. I also suspect there is, and this is very depressing to say, I suspect there is a great deal of national indifference towards the outcome of this referendum. There have been weeks at a time where it has not felt like there has been much attention going towards the campaign. It was pretty low down in news bulletins yesterday. It's quite a remarkable thing when you consider there are 2 days until the result of what I think will go down in history as a very significant moment for this country.
Yeah, I think in a way, a lot of us looking on were expecting the Yes campaign to gain momentum at some point, and we feel like that momentum's never really been achieved.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think that we're now in the final phase, the very last days, and we don't see a sort of an acceleration of the campaign. I still think in some ways the Yes side struggles to cut through with compelling new messages. I thought we got a major speech from Pat Dodson. I thought a really impressive speech.
It's not about separatism. It's not about elitism. It's not about special privileges. It's about being able to navigate the course under our direction and under our judgment and under our responsibilities and our accountabilities. Now, that's what's being asked for, and we ask the Australian people, the decent, good people in this country. And that's
but
all Australians.
There's a lot more that needs to be done.
We are expecting a no result on Saturday if the polls are any guide. And David, we learned this week what people believe is the most resonant argument of the no campaign according to our polling, which is that the voice will divide by race. Why is that such a resonant argument in your view?
I think there's something fundamental about the voice that has aggravated, a significant portion of the population. We found that when we asked people about what was the argument for the no side that was most persuasive, 22% nominated that it would divide Australians by race. This is totally contested as a claim. People like Noel Pearson say, look, that's just not what the voice is about. It's about recognising the first occupants of Australia. They could be white and fair-haired. It's not about skin colour or any other racial stereotype. However, we asked the question because we wanted to know whether it was cutting through, and it's really important to recognise it is cutting through. It is playing a part here. And I think that's because there is an element to the voice that taps into anxiety about how people are doing in the world, whether other people are getting a privilege that they don't have, whether other people are getting better treatment. And I do think that that's something that the No campaign has actively stoked as an issue, and I do think that we're seeing that that has been working.
Sean, that's almost become the key message that we've heard out of the entire referendum debate, that this will divide us by race. Why has it been so resonant?
Look, I'm not sure it has been. I think there's a really important distinction here, and the distinction is between what people say has been persuasive for them and what has actually persuaded them. I think we have to start any discussion of a referendum and a likely referendum result from the historical understanding that without bipartisan support, you are all but dead in the water. It was always going to be very difficult to get a referendum up. Now, we can have lots of discussions, and that there will be lots of discussions about what has gone wrong, what has gone right on both sides, but it was always unlikely to succeed once Peter Dutton had decided to say no. So once you get there, you have to accept that over half of the Australian population was likely to end up in a no place, in which case, at that point, you're not really looking for what has persuaded them. You're looking for the reason that they are most happy to attach their pre-existing position to. And the great thing about the line that this is divided is it enables people to feel quite good about a decision that I think they could end up feeling quite bad about. Some people will accuse no voters of being racist. Certainly, I think it is possible to argue that at the very least, it displays a great indifference to the plight of many Indigenous people. But if you can say, well, I think this divides the nation by race, then it places you on the other side of that divide. So I think it's quite a comfortable resting place. That doesn't mean it's what got people there in the first place.
That's a very good point. And it brings us to the sort of politics of this. This is sort of the first major battle between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and opposition leader Peter Dutton. It's been fiercely fought. I want to ask you both what the campaign has taught us about the style of each leader. Sean, I'll go to you first.
I think we have seen from both leaders things we have seen from each of them before. From Anthony Albanese, we have seen a focus on the vibe of things. We have seen a shying away from detail. We have seen, I think, until quite recently at least, an illustration of the overriding belief of this government that you deliver change by not offending people.
And secondly, to have a non-binding advisory committee. There's nothing to fear here, everything to gain. Because if we keep doing the same thing, we should expect the same outcomes. So by listening and getting that engagement with Indigenous Australians, you will get better outcomes. And you get.
I think that has been the overall attempt of the Yes campaign, obviously led by the government, an attempt to paint this as broadly a good thing without ever really tackling the substance that the voice is trying to grapple with. And a really good example of this is that it's only been in the dying stages of the campaign that they've really wanted to argue strongly the fact that Indigenous people are really disadvantaged, that there are huge areas of disadvantage amongst Indigenous people. You would have thought that could have come in at the start of the campaign, but apparently that offends some voters. It gets their backs up. So the Yes campaign hasn't tackled that. So I think that does indicate that general aerial approach to campaigning that this government sometimes displays. On Peter Dutton's side, I think you've seen a bit of looseness. I think this is a really under-remarked trait of Peter Dutton's as leader, but as a politician stretching back a long time. He can often be led to things by interviewers. He'll often agree to things that are put to him. he'll kind of wade into things without thinking them through. And the most obvious example of that during this campaign was his pledge to hold a second referendum on constitutional recognition.
So you'd hold another referendum
of Australians.
So you'd hold another referendum.
I believe very strongly. Yes, I believe very strongly that it is the right thing to do. But enshrined.
He seems to have backed away from that pretty significantly in the weeks following it, almost as though he hadn't quite thought it through.
David, what are your reflections on the style of the two leaders and what the campaign has shown us about that?
I think it's shown us in terms of the Prime Minister's performance, he's not as persuasive as he thought he was. He started the campaign for The Voice when he was well ahead in the polls, seemed to be in a very strong political position, and I think over time he hasn't really cut through sharply enough with a positive message about The Voice. So that's a big wake-up call to the government. They cannot persuade quite as well as they thought. On Peter Dutton's side, those points by Sean were really good. You know, he has said some things that are pretty out there during the campaign. He said blatant falsehoods that we've picked him up on in the paper, but I don't think he really cares. He just sort of says them on the way through in the interviews. His approach at the moment, leading up to Saturday, is to get angrier and angrier every day.
And the proposal to insert a new chapter into the Constitution, deliberately keeping the detail from Australians, is without precedent. It's reckless, and the Prime Minister should take full responsibility for his actions, and he should apologise for it.
It's a very, very fierce performance from him every day in his doorstops. There's also a sense of great concern and alarm when he talks about the situation in Israel. So we're seeing a couple of issues make him very forceful, and I'm not sure that that's going to work for him in the long term. What we've seen in the polling is, even though we find a majority are against The Voice, we still find a clear majority in favour of Anthony Albanese as preferred Prime Minister. It's something like 47 to about 25%. So there's a big lead for the Prime Minister. There is currently a lead in the polls for Labor in the Resolve Political Monitor. And so I question the hope that I've heard from some Liberals that unleashing this powerful movement against The Voice will then give them momentum to gain political ground as the Conservative side of politics at the next election. And I think that's quite contestable.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Let's talk about that. The No campaign's been extraordinarily effective. I wonder if there are any broader lessons that the Conservative side of politics will take out of the No campaign's tactics and apply more generally to the federal political sphere or to other campaign issues like climate change or trans issues. What do you think, David?
Well, I've talked to Conservatives who are so impressed with what Advance Australia and Fair Australia have done with their campaigning on the No side. They see that as an example of something that they could use on other issues. And one of them mentioned climate change to me as an example. So there will be a reckoning after the votes are counted. Who did well? Why did they do well? How do we use that at the next election? So the objective is pretty clear. Build this momentum against Anthony Albanese, force Labor onto the defensive in suburban seats, even if the Liberals cannot win the Teal seats. Take Labor into a position where it might even have to be in minority government and rely on the Greens and the Teals, and then set Labor up in the same way that Tony Abbott brought untold pressure to bear on Labor when it was in minority government last time with the Greens and Julia Gillard as Prime Minister. That's the dream of the Liberals after this referendum. I'm not saying it's happening. The polls do not show that's happening, but that's what they're going to try and do.
We don't obviously want to preempt the result on Saturday night, but if No wins and Yes loses, as seems likely, what will the reaction be of the Aboriginal leadership, the men and women who have spent so many years, decades in some cases, working towards this reform? Sean?
You know, I don't think Australians are really prepared for this. I think most people will be quite shocked when they see what happens on Saturday night, and in the days following. I think there will be tears. I think we'll see many images of Indigenous people crying on the news. I think we will see anger in some parts. I think we will see immense frustration, with the overall sensation being that they have not been listened to. And that will then lead to a real discussion about what comes next. And of course, you've had some Indigenous people already, Noel Pearson notably, saying this will be it for them in trying to lead a reconciliation movement. And really what they're indicating there is that they'll be passing it on to the younger generation, and that the implication seems to be that that younger generation will be less in the compromise bucket, whether we might see stronger demands from them.
David?
I think it's going to be immensely challenging, and there's no way to look past a no outcome and say, well, look, we'll continue ahead with something else. The idea of the voice in another form becomes incredibly challenging, almost impossible. If the people say no to it, Anthony Albanese can't say, we're going to do a different kind of voice in a different way. Voice, treaty, truth is the Uluru Statement from the Heart from Indigenous leaders. A rejection of that at this referendum means there's not only a rejection of the voice, but also questions about whether Indigenous leaders can get traction on a Makarrata Commission, which is truth-telling, or any process towards treaty. Leaders like Lydia Thorpe say, vote no to the voice because we want treaty. But a rejection at the referendum does not indicate a pathway towards those other objectives. And unfortunately for the Indigenous leaders of this country, a no outcome is going to be a huge setback, which is why Noel Pearson says it would be a setback for reconciliation for a generation.
Come Sunday morning, whatever the result, we're still going to have the gap, and we're still going to need policies to close that gap. Albanese has already ruled out legislating a voice through Parliament if it's rejected as an addition to the Constitution. Will he announce alternative measures to address Aboriginal disadvantage, David?
I think he will have to, and I also think that the opposition would be obliged to, in any realistic assessment, come up with a plan of its own, which it hasn't done. However, I don't think that that's going to be a short-term project, because I think the aftermath of the referendum, actually yes or no, is to say, we've heard the message from the Australian people. We also have other things we need to get onto. And I think it's very clear that Anthony Albanese will need to get onto something he's been doing, but which hasn't been getting as much attention: action on cost of living, the economy, other issues. So I think that's where the debate will go. But we must come back sooner or later to, before the next election, where are the concrete steps that are going to do something on closing the gap, because that is meant to be the entire reason for this voice debate.
Sean, just quickly, what will Albanese and Dutton do on closing the gap after the referendum?
Albanese's challenge will be to find a way of showing that he is listening to Indigenous communities and acting on the advice that he receives, but without a formal voice structure. He can't have emphasised the importance of listening to people on the ground so much for so long this year and not follow that advice clearly himself. The other thing I think is he will have to, and I think this might be a lesson for his whole prime ministership, he will have to forge ahead on his own, getting these things done without getting buy-in from the Australian people. He will have to recognise that change sometimes has to come direct from a government without the explicit permission of the Australian people. That is often how change is actually delivered. And so I think that will be a really interesting turning point on Indigenous affairs, but perhaps more broadly for the Albanese prime ministership.
Finally, I want to ask you both a really big question. David, I'll go to you first. What has the voice debate shown us about ourselves?
It's told us, reminded us of how conservative Australia is as a country. Australians can be very conservative. They rejected a republic in 1999. They appear to be willing to reject the voice in 2023. Change is incredibly difficult and division is easy. And we're now looking at a divided country, a country that's divided on the voice. But not just that. We see images of in the street of people protesting in favour of, those terrible attacks in Israel. We see communities set against each other. Division has become easier in Australian politics. Social media is part of the reason why it's easier. Trust in politicians is lower. So when we get assurances about how the voice will offer a benefit, 40% of voters simply respond with a no to the idea that it would reduce waste or improve outcomes. And so that's the Australia that we're looking at. Much more divided, much more prone to a negative message. Very hard to get leadership in that kind of environment.
Sean, what has the voice revealed about Australians?
Nothing very good. The overriding message is that Australians do not understand that there is a problem that needs to be addressed in Indigenous. Australia. Polling for the Yes campaign suggests almost 40% of Australians don't believe there is disadvantage in Indigenous communities, which is completely at odds with reality. That shows that we have failed as a nation not only to come to grips with the past, which was always going to be difficult, we have failed to come to grips with the present and with our responsibility to fix that present. And then at the broader level, it has shown us, I think, that we are almost incapable of conducting a mature debate. This is a national discussion of significant import in which ridiculous untruths, paranoid scare campaigns have been given precedence in our national media, often over important, substantive discussions of actual problems. And then the final thing I think is, and this goes to the first point, just wide indifference to Indigenous people. And a number of Indigenous people have said that during the debate, that this is more or less a referendum on what the broader Australian people think of them. And I think, sadly, there is probably a lot of truth in that.
Well, that's a rather depressing note to end on, but we will have to end there. Thank you both very much for your contribution today, and I'm sure we'll reconvene at some point in the future to discuss the aftermath. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Jack.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance by Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy this show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thanks for listening.